Hi everyone, this video is going to be a quick introduction to Adobe Substance Painter. We're going to use Rhino geometry. In an earlier video I made this composition using shrink wrap and piping curves, and I have two colors applied, two materials applied to these geometries, and this has been exported as an OBJ, and now we're going to bring it into Substance Painter. So how do we do that? We are going to create a new file. We need to select a template. The top one, PBR metallic roughness, is fine. We want to set a document resolution. We can change this later or still export higher resolution textures if we need to. By default, I would use 20 by 48. Because we haven't unwrapped our geometry, we are going to use auto unwrap. And auto unwrap is not something you would use if you had unwrapped this previously, say in Maya or Blender or even Rhino. But since we don't have any UV maps for the geometry that I'm bringing in, we're going to make sure that auto unwrap is clicked. Then finally, we need to select our file, and I call this Painter Test 3. So now we're going to open this up. It's unwrapping our textures, and here we are in Painter. Okay, so let's look at our Painter file. Now we need to be aware of a few things. One, we're just seeing the geometry. If we hit F1, this is going to show us the geometry and the unwrapped UV maps. So Painter made these maps. If we hit F3, we can just look at the maps, and if we hit F1, we're looking at both, and F2, just the geometry. So those hotkeys are important. To navigate, I can zoom in and out with the middle mouse button. To rotate, I hold down on the Alt key and use the left mouse button. And then with the Alt key and the right mouse button, I'm zooming in and out. Okay, great. So it looks like we have a color on our object, and we don't. However, this is just this brownish color is coming from the light in the scene, and it's illuminated by an HDRI file. There are many included in Painter by default, and some of these will have very obvious colors, like this cave and tree forest. HDRI map has a green color. So I prefer to, when I'm texturing, use an environment map that doesn't have a color. Studio 2 is pretty good. And then when we're doing test renderings, we can always change this back to a different map. So now I've changed this to Studio 2, and let's talk about painting in Substance Painter. So hit F2, and now I'm looking at these geometries. Because I had two different materials coming from Rhino, I had on the one hand a texture called mass that's applied to these surfaces, and then a texture called tube applied to these guys. I can work on these textures, work on these two different texture sets independently. So I can kind of toggle them on and off here if I don't want to see the objects that have these different textures. But just be aware that I select each texture set that I want to work with up here. And for example, if I'm painting, I can't paint on this tube because I don't have this one selected. I can only paint on these masses. Before we start painting, let's be aware that there are two different types of layers that we're going to cover in this tutorial. By default, Painter is going to open with a paint layer, and you make paint layers with this paintbrush. Delete layers with this trash can. The paint layer and then the fill layer. And you'll primarily use fill layers, but it's good to explain the basics of paint layers, of Substance Painter using paint layers. So what are those basics? One, we come in and we start painting. What are we painting? We're painting color. And if we look down here, so if we go to the paint properties, we come down and we're painting base color, right? But we can also paint other things. We are also painting height, but this height information is set to 0, so there's no height being applied. If I bring this up to white on the right here and start painting, you can see that my paint stroke looks a little bit different, and that's because I'm painting height information, but because we don't have any displacement on currently, we can't see that height information. So that brings me to my next sort of global setting that you'll want to play with is, so we have the environment, below this we have the shader settings. And by default it looks like displacement is on, but there is no height set. As we bring this value up to say, I don't know, let's make it 0.1. Now you can see that we have height information here. It looks very crude, but we can raise the subdivision count, and now it looks much more smooth. What this displacement setting should be is something you have to experiment with depending on the project. And we can control all of the displacement in the painter file globally here. What we might want to do, however, is give height some, I don't know, reasonable strength here, like 0.075. Then be aware that each individual layer that has height we can control independently. And we do that over here by now going to height and being aware that like every layer has, just like Photoshop, an opacity value that we can play with. So now we could say we're going to paint height in this layer, but we're going to bring the opacity down to 45 so that it works better. So now as we paint height, we are getting, you know, these sorts of strokes being applied to the model. And now we also know that we can adjust the height down here. So if we want it to be inset versus raised, we can take our height here and sort of now we're carving into the object as we make these strokes. And all we're doing, if we look at the map here, if we hit F1, and we should have different channels that we can look at here. So we're looking at the material here, but we could also look at, say, just the height. You can see that we are applying grayscale strokes to the object, and then that's being used to apply our height information. And we can look at, we're also painting normals, and that's another way of getting a sense of height on the material. Okay, so now we're looking at the full material, and of course we could also change the color. We can paint over here as well if we chose, but it's easier typically to paint just on the model itself, right? So now we're painting height and color, and if we wanted to stop painting height, we could just take our height information back to 0 and make sure that it's actually 0, like that. And now we're just painting color again on the object, right? So whether you would want to paint these things at the same time is up to you. And it's, oh, this is interesting. I'm painting 0 height, and it's actually then getting rid of the carving. So that's kind of interesting. And I guess I could also paint 0 height there. So that's actually getting rid of the height. So what if we liked this height? Maybe we don't like the color. We don't like the red color. We could then, the white color. We could here in the layer go back to color, and then we could just take the opacity of the color channel to 0. And now we have all of the height information, but none of the color. We could then add another paint layer on top and come in and just paint over what we've done. And because height here is set to 0, we're not adding any height information. And so we're just coming in and we're painting over that. So we can paint with color. We could paint in material mode. So if there was some, I don't know, concrete texture here, we could go to material mode and actually paint with that material. Okay, but if we were going to paint with a material, what I would say one should do is not use a paint layer, but use a fill layer. And fill layers are really useful because fill layers allow us to to both apply material globally, but also work with a painting workflow if we choose. So how would we do that? We have made a fill layer here. I'm going to grab, let's say this concrete. There's different concrete asphalt colors. Oh, it's just kind of, as I select these things, it's kind of popping in here. You can do it that way. You could also make a fill layer like this, and I could drag this over to material mode and drop it in here. So when you apply something to your model, there are different ways that a material, it can be a material that we've made, or it could be that you've made. It could be a material that's shipping with Substance Painter. We have to determine how it's being projected onto the object. And we do that by typically switching to triplanar projection, because unless you've laid out your UVs very, very neatly, you might get weird seams. And so the default will be UV projection, but we're going to switch to triplanar projection. And triplanar projection gives us a more seamless tiling even over complex objects like this. And we can then adjust the scale. So if we go too high, this one's nice because it doesn't have a lot of, it's hard to see any repetition, but there are other textures, and we can replace this really easily with, like, say, this concrete. And now I think if we change the tiling to something really high, you'll start to get this wallpaper effect, right? So you have to think about, like, what's a good level, a good scale for the texture so that it's not too strange. Okay, so fill layers are cool. We can, let's say we wanted to now paint a different kind of material on top of this one. We've applied everything globally with this fill layer. That's great. We have this triplanar projection on. So let's try to paint a material on top of this. So we could make another fill layer. Maybe instead I'll just duplicate this layer, because that will then have the triplanar projection already on it. So I don't have to change this again. And now I'm simply going to come over and change the material to this other one. Okay, so what's happened here? I'm completely overlaying material one with this other one. And if I change the order of the layers, they'll just stack as you might expect. This one's coming on top. One thing that maybe is, like, the base color is like the layer mode here. So there are all of these layer modes, just like Photoshop. So by default, we're here on base color, and we can, fade this one out. So we can blend these two colors together. The other thing we can do is adjust the height. So both of these layers have height information, and the default layer mode or layer blending setting for height is not normal, which would just replace everything. It's linear dodge, so it's adding height information. So just be aware that your height information is being added, and so you might want to either change the way that the height information is blending, or you might, if things get too lumpy or the height gets too high, you could start pulling this height down in the opacity here. Okay, all right, but now we have all of this applied, and but we want to actually, let's say, paint this material selectively on top of the one below. How would we do that? Well, we can add a mask. So I'm going to right click and add a black mask. So that's then going to mask everything out. But you'll see now I'm painting by default in the mask. And so wherever I paint, I'm painting white by default, and I'm revealing that mask. If I want a bigger brush size, I can bring this up. Now I'm painting more. By default, my opacity is 100%. That's fine. So I'm coming in and I'm just painting around, and what it's really doing is simply revealing the information below in these white areas. So I think that that's a very easy way to control things. We can also then, if we don't like this, we can clear the mask and we can paint it again. But that can get cumbersome, so a really smart way to work with masks is to add paint layers to masks. So here I'm right-clicking the mask, I'm adding a paint layer, and now I can reveal that mask, right? And then if I don't like this paint layer, I can toggle it off and I can add a new paint layer. Where are you? Paint, right? And I can paint in this one, right? And add information here, da, 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 da. And then I am doing that, and I can say, oh, do I like this one, or do I like that one, or do I like them both together? So this gives us a good way to control this, and you're not always having to like replace the mask. So this is, I think, so this is why fill layers are really, really handy, because it gives you a lot of control on how the painting happens. And it's more of a non-destructive workflow, and one that you can quickly change and experiment with, like adding and subtracting. So right now I've just been painting white and adding this away. If I want to remove stuff, I can remove this material. I can hit X, and now that is that's being removed. And then X again will invert the brush back to white. And that is working well. The other cool thing about this is you can imagine, so I have this all set up here with my material. I have my fill layer, I have my fill layer, I have my mask. I can come back into the layer itself. And I have this material here. I can just drop in and replace that material with completely different ones. I don't know why this is, go to fit here. Seems to be changing. It's kind of weird here. Let me go back to my camera. I might have a strange camera setting here. So 30, let me look at my camera and focal length. Let me go to 35, enter, and then hit F. Sometimes, maybe, hopefully that will fix things. That seemed to fix things, just changing the focal length of the camera. So all of this is just to say that you can then, you can kind of mask out areas and then experiment with different materials just by swapping them in and out, right? And then all of the other settings will be the same. And what I want to do here is now I'm using just these default materials from Substance, but I also have, you can also use materials that you've made. So if I go back to, let's see, my documents folder and Adobe Sampler, this is where I've made some materials, and I have this patterned rock material. I can drag this over, and this is going to import as a base material. And then this is something that I could very easily bring in here. Taking a minute. Oh, okay, why is this going slow? It's because this patterned rock 3 is a 4K material, so it's pretty heavy duty. Let me get rid of that. Can I get rid of it here? I cannot. So let me go back to this, exports. Yeah, you can see this is a really high-res texture. It's 140 megabytes rather, 135 megabytes. So this one is a 2K texture, patterned rock 2. Let me bring that one in. Import. And that should go a little bit more quickly. Although this does look cool. I'm going to bring this over and swap that one in. And I'm just going to pause the video while it imports. Okay, it's imported, it has applied, and so there we go. We have this material, and it's applied to this spot. Maybe we would actually like this material to be more extensive on our object, so I'm going to swap it to this fill layer and then come back up to this guy, and then maybe we will put our maybe we put this one here. Even though it's heavy duty, we can put that there. And now we have these two different materials that we've made blending together, and we can tweak the tiling of this if we want. And we can tweak the rotation. It should be tweaking this, I'm not sure. I think it's because it's so high res that it makes it really difficult. So in that case, let's just go ahead and put a different material there. And I'm going to pause the video while it sorts this out. Okay, we're back. I just had to delete the material or delete this and reapply it. So now you can see that I've kind of applied this thing on top of the material that we had. And if I go back to the fill layer, I could continue painting this stuff on here if I wanted. Then I could come back to base color, and I could decide, do I want that to be completely opaque, or do I want to see a little bit of the original color beneath? And then in my material here, because it was made in Substance Designer, I have all of these options and variations that I could play with. And these are also being controlled by my hue parameter here. So I can switch this around and experiment with different colorations to the material. So that looks pretty cool. Now, maybe I would do a quick rendering of this, but before I do, I want to apply materials to these. So we've been looking exclusively at the mask. Now I can switch to the tube, and maybe I'll just search for some sort of metal. And let's look from within the material. And metal brushed, that's fine. I can just, this already has something here. Let's delete the layer that's there. Let's delete all the layers, and then I'll just bring this metal brushed over, and it's going to apply to this by default. And then I probably want to go ahead and just, for good measure, throw triplanar projection on this one. We're not going to be real close to this, so it should be fine. And now we can bring our mask back on. Then we can start to think about, let's say, a view that looks good. Let's change our camera. So our camera is more of a 35 millimeter lens, which is great. But if I want it to be more flat and like an oblique view, I could set this to a higher resolution or higher value. It zooms in, then I hit F, and this will get me, that focuses on the object. And now I have a flatter view, and let's go to our rendering settings here. Render view, all right, okay, so by default, I already have this. So if we go to the environment information here, I have this studio environment. I have a clear color? No, because this is set. And so if I start holding down on Shift and right mouse button, using the right mouse button, I'm spinning this around. And maybe I want now a different kind of environment. Maybe I do want more of a daylighting scenario. Okay, so I've now brought in this different HDRI. And this looks kind of cool, like it's on the ground. But I think and then if I hold down on Shift, then I can move this around. And if I look up with my view, holding down on Alt, I can see, more of that environment. So maybe we like the lighting, but having the environment here is probably not so useful. So what we can do now is go to environment and start scrolling down, and let's add a clear color. And this is where you can make any kind of background color that you want. So we'll use the lighting from the HDRI, but now we have that color gone. We have this color instead of the background, and then I can continue to hold down on Shift and think about, like, where do I want that lighting to come from? Like, what will be interesting shadows, and what can I do to kind of frame this in a nice way. Here I'm going to override the resolution, and I'll make this like 2000 by 2000, so it will be a square proportion. I can type the right thing in. That cool. Now I have this. That's working pretty well. And now I'm looking at this and thinking, okay, well the texture, overall texture here is looking a little strange. And so let me fix that. So I'm going to go back to Painter. And I just think that this texture, if I go back to my mask, right, and go back to my fill layer here, I'm feeling like the tiling is a little, like the texture is a little big. So I'm just going to simply tile it more, maybe to like 4, try 6. That looks a little better. The rotation, kind of move this around, so maybe that looks a little better. I could even try something like, I don't know, with 12. What does that do? And I can start to see a little bit of the wallpaper effect there. So bring this back to 8, maybe. Rotate it again. There's probably an offset. Can move the texture a little bit if I don't like things here. Again, play with the rotation. So things are a little bit, and then the hardness of the edge, like that, maybe something like that. Let's see if this looks a little bit better. You're getting some weird artifacts on the edges here, and let's just triple check our displacement setting. We have a high subdivision count. We could play with this scale, maybe bringing that down just a little bit. Maybe get less deformation. That could help a little bit, maybe. So yeah, it does look a little, I don't know, blurred out there. So let's try one more thing here with our tiling, rotation. Try to look for things that look less distorted at that moment. That looks a little bit better. I don't know if we can offset it. Just looking for ways that things might look a bit better. Maybe that still looks a little odd there. And so maybe that's something we'd have to go back and look at the mesh. And then it also looks like there's that seam there from the projection. So I'm trying to get rid of that. And okay, I don't know if I can fully get rid of it for this, but I think that scaling the texture down began to make this look a bit better. But I think this lighting looks a little bit flat, so I'm going to go back to the HDRI and maybe I'll just try a different one. Like, I don't know, what's this one look like? A little... That one's a little more dramatic. I like that better. So now Shift and right mouse button, and I'm just going to keep working with this. Where's this rotation happening? If it's less intuitive to do it with Shift, I think that looks... Ooh, that's kind of nice. I'm getting more shadows, more dramatic shadows there. And then I can also come back up to the environment and I can control the rotation here if we want to do this a bit more precisely. But could we get that? Maybe we don't want that shadow going off the image here at the bottom. So that's looking pretty good. And then we could save this out. Okay, so this is covering, this covered the difference between paint layers, fill layers, and the way that we can control the different opacities of those layers, adding displacement, changing the background, and using the texture sets here to apply materials to different objects, and then finally doing a rendering here. One last thing I'll mention just about these renderings is that as you move around, like I might accidentally go below my ground, and maybe that makes for an interesting view. So you can do that. You can also, like, if your ground is in a weird spot, you can, in the environment here, let me make sure that I'm seeing the ground. So yeah, I'm seeing the ground here. In our environment, you can control where the ground is. So it's kind of coming down. We could make it lower if we wanted, or we could bring it up into the object. Like if we wanted to clip the object a little bit with the ground, we could do that. We can also, let me just bring it back to kind of where it was. I think it was like -14 or something. So bring this up. You can see like the object is floating a little bit. So that's pretty good. Like that's kind of where it was, I think. Good enough. We can turn that off altogether. So then we don't have to worry about it. What it does mean is that you're not going to get any light bouncing off of this ground. We'll find the object. You're not going to get any light bouncing off this ground, so this is something that you have to experiment with. It's really freaking out a little bit here. Okay, cool. Now I should be able to... When this happens, what I'm experiencing is the image is the geometry is disappearing. I can come back to my camera and take it back to say like a different lens length, like 25, hit F, focus in, and then if I want to go back to my flatter lens length, like 400 or 500, I can do this and then hit F again, and that should fix the problem. So now I can rotate around this object and I don't have to worry about the ground. I can probably still render it even if I'm below the ground. If I turn that on, go back to environment here and look at the ground. The ground, where are you, ground? If I turn that on, yeah, you're just getting ambient occlusion here where it's kind of like shading that, and you're getting a slightly different light quality because it's bouncing the light up. So it would be up to you if you don't want the ground, or if you want the ground, you can play with that. But definitely getting rid of the ground makes it possible to not worry about. Like you look at this thing from any different angle, and let's say that's going to be less dark. So you can get some interesting views that are unexpected just by tumbling all the way around the object. Let me go back to, so yeah, you can see here, turning on the ground makes that darker, and then having this on makes it brighter. So I think that's looking pretty good. Maybe I'll go back to my view. Just original view will be easier in this. I'm going to be just a little bit above the ground. Liking that view. Maybe going back to iRay here. See what we're given, and then I'm going to turn the ground back on with the environment, and look, should see it. And then I'm just going to slightly rotate my view so I'm more even with the object. And then if the object is floating a little bit, I can bring that ground back up to -14, and that should, oops, -14, not -24, -14. Good Lord. Let's see. Where are you? -14. There we go. -14.5. So close enough for this. So then I can wait for this to render out, and I've got something. All right, so this takes you through the process, and we'll go over some advanced techniques in the next video. Thanks for watching.